Okay, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to today's seminar. I am really delighted to welcome you all here to one of the very first in-person event again here at the FIA premises in quite a long time. It's really great to see that things might be slowly normalizing again, at least let's hope so. My name is Bart Gaans and I'm a leading research fellow here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and once again welcome to this seminar on Arctic connectivity. This seminar also doubles as a book launch of the research report that appeared quite recently on Nordic-Baltic connectivity with Asia via the Arctic. It was published at the International Center for Defense and Security, the ICDS in Tallinn, in close cooperation with FIA. And it was co-edited by Kristi Raik, Frank Juris and myself. So today we'll have a panel discussion with some, at least, of the contributing authors on a few key themes in the book. Before that, however, we'll have a word of welcome by Elisabeth Bauer. She is director at the Office for the Baltic Countries at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And the foundation has been really generously supporting our project, and on behalf of the three editors, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to CAS for funding the project and also for supporting research on topical and important issues such as Arctic connectivity and security. So thank you very much. After the welcoming words, Kristi Raik, who is also a former FIAN, a former colleague of mine, and she is currently director at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the ICDS, will introduce some of the key findings of the book. And like I said, after that, I will have the privilege to chair the panel discussion with some of the contributors, and I will introduce them all to you later on. So now I will give the floor to Elisabeth for her welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Bart, very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends of FIA and of CAS, and of ICDS as well. First of all, thank you for coming. I'm very much honored to welcome you on behalf of the partners as well. And this book on Arctic connectivity is a strong contribution to the discussions around about what will be the outcome of the changing structures. The special connection between security challenges and maybe not only opportunities, but as well economic necessities or at least realities. As we all know, for a long time the Arctic was seen or wanted to be seen as an example for cooperation beyond ideological positions. When I started my work in the NB8 region in 2015, we organized a discussion at the Arctic Circle on the change in the security landscape due to the melting ice. It was 1 out of 4 at that time in the Arctic Circle. Today, nearly 1/3 of the discussions over there deal with this topic. So you see the change over there. So why is the Arctic so important and influential on geopolitical and geostrategic developments? The special interest to the Arctic came up to me in 2007. You might remember when Russia put its flag to the North Pole, setting a sign about the influential zone or zone of interest. I was working in St. Petersburg at that time, and a project was brought up about the Cold War in the Arctic. There I learned a lot of the strategic importance. We did the conference and the publication in 2008. The conference took place 1 week after Georgia, and it was said in that week the next Cold War, so it was really very up to date. The next step, not so much registered in the West, was the military doctrine in 2009 in Russia, when Russia decided to put more people and material up north, far away from anything what happened after that. With the speed of the melting ice, the strategic possibilities and changes became obvious. But interesting enough, the focus on the Arctic became only stronger since the elephant in the room, the country with no Arctic connection, declares itself as an Arctic country. China really changed the game. If you would put it very hard, in the end China made the game changer, since there's interest is on the floor, Arctic is much more seen as a region of interest and influence than ever. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned the importance of this book in the very beginning, and the results of the research will be taken into account. I would like to thank all the authors and contributors to this volume, and a personal special thank to the editors Bart Gens, Frank Juris, and a very special one to Christy Reich for the very trustful cooperation. On general, I have to say, it always is and was a pleasure to work together with FIA and with the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute and ICDS. I wish all of us very fruitful discussion, and thank you for your attention.
So, thank you so much. Thank you to Bart, thank you to Elisabeth for your kind words of introduction. Many thanks to the Finnish Institute of International Affairs for organizing this event on an important topic. We have been working together on this project now for almost 2 years in very good cooperation with FIA and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. So I'm really grateful for this cooperation, and special thank you to Elisabeth Bauer for the support of CAS and for the very kind of substantial interest in the topic and encouragement to work on it. It has been really essential for the project to be successful. We started discussing this project approximately 2 years ago, and actually we started from this notion of connectivity as a growing foreign policy priority for the Nordic Baltic countries. And then we quickly kind of turned our attention to the Arctic as a region of growing geostrategic importance, and obviously a very important region for the Nordic Baltic countries, and a region where there are new economic opportunities, as was mentioned already, that are intertwined with this impact of climate change. As we all know, the global warming proceeds at least as twice as rapidly in the Arctic as in the rest of the world, with dramatic effects, and it's a huge source of concern for the Arctic countries. But at the same time, it is opening up new possibilities to make use of the natural resources in the Arctic and to develop the routes and increase connectivity via the Arctic. And at the same time, these developments are overshadowed by tightening great power competition. So what we do in the book, we look at how these different dynamics are intertwined, and we kind of focus on the concept of connectivity, and ask what do the changes in the Arctic region then mean for the potential of increased connectivity between the Nordic Baltic states and Asia via the Arctic, and what are the opportunities and risks involved, and what are the perspectives of major actors, not only Arctic states, but also China being an increasingly active player in the Arctic. And I would say this was one of the most exciting contributions of this project, that we brought experts of Russia and China together to discuss the Arctic. And we realized that there are important differences in how they assess the Arctic. There are also some similarities, and there is the very intriguing questions of what is the scope of Russian-Chinese cooperation in the Arctic, which the book also touches upon. And obviously both Russia and China have their strategic interests in the region. They also have their economic interests, but all of it is really underpinned by the geopolitical developments and the security issues that have become so much more relevant in the region. So it's a complex set of questions. And when you look at just quickly at the map, so that we all have it in front of our eyes, what we are talking about in the book. You can see here the Arctic Ocean sea routes. We focus a lot in the book on the Northern Sea Route, which is the main kind of main issue of growing connectivity potentially. And another map then shows or tells a lot about the Chinese interest and Chinese perspective on this issue. That there is the Northern Sea Route potentially providing an alternative route to the southern one, which then makes it from the Chinese perspective a very interesting project, and explains partly the Chinese interest to be more involved in the Arctic. A couple of words on the main concepts of the book. Connectivity is a topic that in Europe has been discussed a lot in relation to Asia. And we have Bart in the project who has worked a lot on Asia-Europe connectivity and knows very well the discussions in that framework. And what we argue in the book is that many of the issues that have been discussed in depth in Asia-Europe connectivity discussions are very much relevant in the Arctic, although of course Arctic being a remote polar region with its very specific weather conditions and so on, it's a special, unique region. But then the issues raised from the European and Nordic perspective on how to make connectivity sustainable, how to make sure it's kind of environmentally and socially sustainable, and how to make sure it's rules-based and transparent. These same issues are relevant also in the Arctic. And the project was then greatly helped by the contribution of two other FIA colleagues, Mikael Wiegel and Harri Mikkola, who have worked a lot on geoeconomics. And so in the book we rely on their analysis of different perspectives on geoeconomics in order to make sense of connectivity. And there are three perspectives that they present in the book. One is geoeconomics as economic statecraft, which very shortly means that states use economic power in order to advance their geopolitical interests, and similarly to geopolitical competition, you have a zero-sum rivalry also in geoeconomics, and states compete over who controls connections, who controls flows, and they try to use connections to create asymmetric dependencies on the side of other actors in order to gain more power, and they may also weaponize economic tools for geostrategic purposes. So this is a very relevant perspective in analyzing the Chinese activity in the Arctic. But then there is another perspective of economic geography, which is closely linked to this idea of positive interdependence, that connectivity actually can be pursued in a transparent rules-based manner so that it is beneficial to all the actors involved, and it does not have to be zero-sum, and at the same time this perspective kind of challenges the traditional realist understanding of security, which is focused on territoriality. And here the focus moves to flows and connections and networks, and it also means then that the security-related concerns that arise with more connectivity are focused on how to make the connections secure, how to make the flows secure, and how to be resilient to different shocks, and then how to ensure the rules-based, transparent nature of connections. And there is obviously a tension between this economic statecraft approach and the economic geography approach. Just to bring an example, the Northern Sea route is something where Russia claims that it is under Russia's jurisdiction, whereas this is not the view shared by other players in the Arctic who stress then that it is international waters, there is a right of transit, and this disagreement is a source of tensions. And then a third perspective is geoeconomics as discourse, which is an approach based on constructivist theory, and it looks at how states or different actors kind of construct discourses about economic power, about connections that can work as securitization strategies, that can work as a way to legitimize the actions of policymakers. And an example from the book is from Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen, who analyzes the Russian discourse on the hydrocarbon culture and how that is used in Russia to legitimize kind of Russia's policies in the Arctic, which are critically analyzed in different chapters of the book. Then a couple of words on the key findings, which will then be discussed in more detail by the panel. No surprise to anyone following the Arctic region, the geoeconomic and geopolitical tensions have both increased, and this is something that overshadows connectivity. And the book kind of is in line with a lot of previous research that points to the limits, also possibilities, but especially the limits of actually increasing, for example, the use of the Northern Sea route and other forms of connectivity because of the different dynamics in the Arctic mentioned earlier. It's the climate conditions that still impose very difficult conditions, and then the geoeconomic tensions have grown together with the increased interest of different players, and especially China as a game changer, as was mentioned before. But perhaps above all, it's the geopolitical tensions that make it more difficult to actually develop the possibility to cooperate and have more connectivity through the Arctic, and also connecting the Arctic more to the global networks. So one of the conclusions that we draw is that it's still the kind of traditional realist geopolitical approach that is probably the most relevant to understand what is going on in the Arctic. But at the same time, the economic interests are very obvious, they are strong, and what the book tries to then to contribute to is this understanding of how these two issues are intertwined and how the economic interests and economic activities are on the one hand kind of instrumentalized in the pursuit of geopolitical interests, but at the same time they can be constrained. And in the case of Russia, this is very evident how Russia's ability to make use of the economic potential of the Arctic is very much constrained by the geopolitical perspective that Russia takes on the region. And so, indeed, especially for Russia's approach in the Arctic, it's a realist geopolitical rivalry that is pretty much the name of the game, and the Arctic is an arena of Russia's kind of struggle with the West, and then in addition to understanding the Russian approach, also the way the US has become more involved again in the Arctic after this period of post-Cold War era when the Arctic was not such an important priority for the US. Now we can also see through the geopolitical lens why the US is becoming more engaged and more interested. But then, as I said before, the geoeconomic statecraft perspective is very important in analyzing the Chinese presence in the Arctic, and looking at connectivity from this perspective. It really allows us to explain why China's assertive strategy of becoming more involved has created pushbacks. In the Nordic Baltic countries, there is a very clear shift in how Chinese involvement is seen in the Arctic regions. There's a rapidly growing kind of awareness and concern about the security-related risks and the risk of growing political influence of China, which is discussed in several of the chapters in the book from different perspectives. And then also in the case of China, to a lesser extent than in the case of Russia, but the kind of somewhat aggressive approach is then actually constraining the economic connectivity prospects. And in the Chinese case, the security interests of China are kind of less visible, but they are also significant, and that will be explained later by my colleague Frank Giris, who writes about it also in the book. And there is also a chapter in the book on kind of more like a cross-border perspective on connectivity between Russia and China. How does it play out in the Far East? And it's a very good kind of empirically rich analysis of how there is mistrust posing limits to connectivity, which potentially could be much larger and could be beneficial for both sides, but it just does not quite work out like this. Having said a lot about this kind of security-related aspects and risks, I also want to highlight that there are chapters in the book that look more at the opportunities and this kind of positive interdependence paradigm, and it's still something that is alive in the Arctic, and that some actors, notably the Nordic countries, the EU, also Japan, they want to promote. And there is obviously the field of climate change mitigation, which is a common concern of the Arctic countries and where the cooperation is needed. And also an example of increased cooperation and the potential to have much more cooperation in future on Arctic connectivity is the Japan-EU relationship and their understanding of sustainable connectivity, which is quite similar, and there are many shared interests, as Bart Kynes analyzes in his book chapter. But I wanted to finish with a photo just to remind us all that the Arctic it's about geopolitics, it's about security. This is what is discussed a lot in the book, and then the economic connections and opportunities. But then there are people living there. And the photo is by our colleague Aimar Wenzel, who also contributed to the book. And he's an anthropologist who has done a lot of field work in the Arctic and in Russia's Far East. And these are the people whose lives are directly affected by the geopolitical and geoeconomic developments in the Arctic. And we have one chapter in the book that specifically looks at the rights of indigenous peoples and how these are affected and can be endangered by increased Chinese investments in the Arctic. I will stop here. Thank you very much, and please do take a look at the book on our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristi, for highlighting some of the key themes and key findings of the book. I think we can now move on to the panel discussion, which will delve into or delve a bit deeper into some of the points that Kristi just made, not in the least on Russia's ambitions in the Arctic, China's growing presence, but also on the issue of climate change. I would now like to invite the three speakers to take their seats. We have not three, but four speakers. Our first speaker today is Harri Mikkola, who is a leading research fellow at FIA. But unfortunately, due to a last-minute emergency, he cannot be here physically. But he has been kind enough to make a short recording of his intervention. So we do apologize for this last-minute change in the program, but I'm sure that we're all very much used to watching seminars on a screen. So this can be maybe a reminder of how things used to be, or perhaps how things will continue to be from now. Then our first speaker here physically present is Helge Blakkisrud, who is a senior researcher at the research group on Russia, Asia and international trade at NUPI, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for making your way to Helsinki from Norway. Thank you. Our second speaker will be Frank Juris, who is a research fellow at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, and as you may have heard, is also a co-editor of this newly published book. And then last but not least, we have Julia Jamineva, and she is a senior researcher at the University of Eastern Finland Law School. Welcome to you all. Now, as for the format for this panel discussion, we would try to make it as interactive as possible. So I would ask all the speakers to limit their intervention, their initial intervention, to max 10 minutes each, just to introduce some key arguments of the chapter that you contributed to the book. And this will be followed by questions from the floor. I think we have a good mix of themes. We have Arctic security, we have a perspective on Russia, and also on China, and then also on climate change as both a threat multiplier, but also as a possible avenue for cooperation. So let's start by the taped intervention by Harri Mikkola.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harri Mikkola, and currently I'm leading the Finnish Foreign and Security Policy Project here at FIA. The Arctic has been my main research interest for the past 9 years already, so I feel very happy to be able to address you today through this recording. My apologies that I cannot be physically present there today. For this book, me and my FIA colleague Mikael Wickel wrote a chapter titled Geoeconomics and Arctic Connectivity, an Introduction to Theoretical Approaches. Now, as the title indicates, we approach the Arctic connectivity through the lens of geoeconomics, as the Arctic is expected to transform into a globally important geoeconomic space. Now, I could start my remarks by noting that this transformation is not that straightforward. In reality, several factors hinder it, which in turn raises questions about the validity of these geoeconomic expectations. Now, my personal take is that while especially European Arctic will develop economically, the geoeconomic importance of the region has often been exaggerated in policy formation, public discourse, and also in a popular imagination. Now, this take is based on the fact that the Arctic is a difficult operating environment. Many aspects of Arctic economic development face adverse market conditions, and the strained great power relations is not providing much needed stability and predictability for economic development and connectivity projects, to put it mildly. Also, one could argue that the Arctic region's increasing importance in international affairs is not actually driven by geoeconomics. It is instead driven by old school geopolitics, where especially traditional military dynamics play an increasingly important role, including growth in capabilities, exercising, and strategic signaling. However, contemporary power politics is not only about military issues. Power politics today manifests itself through different channels, many of which are technological or economic in nature. Now, in this context, we have studied geoeconomics here at FIA for quite a few years already, where the notion has basically referred to certain foreign policy strategy indicating the application of economic means of power to realize strategic objectives. However, in this chapter, we broadened our geoeconomic perspective and investigated how different elements of geoeconomics may manifest themselves in the Arctic. We divided the concept in three research paradigms: geoeconomic as economic statecraft, as economic geography, and as discourse. Next, I will give you a broad overview of the chapter by highlighting the key elements of these three paradigms and how they manifest themselves in the Arctic. Now, I will start with the economic geography vantage point. This perspective emphasizes a liberal interdependence in which a new geography of global connectivities and networks are challenging traditional geopolitical paradigms of power and security. In essence, these studies highlight how the global flows of capital, data, goods, and resources shape international or regional integration, often spurring cooperative dynamics. In the Arctic context, this has been a traditional starting point in political discourse and also in expert analysis. Now, according to this view, the economic geographical potential of the Arctic has induced, if not a necessitated cooperation rather than competition between major actors in the region, related, for instance, to region's potential as an international transport route or as an oil and gas reserve. Yet, at least since the 2008 financial crisis, and a bit later because of the intensified great power competition, economic interdependence has increasingly been seen as carrying risks and challenges. These risks include disruptions in global supply chains, economic sanctions, and more generally vulnerabilities associated with the asymmetric aspects of interdependence. Now, this brings me to our next vantage point, that is geoeconomics as economic statecraft. This notion is based on the idea that the states try to leverage their economic power for strategic gain. Here, economic interdependence results in increasing asymmetric dependencies that can be manipulated, exploited, and weaponized. The opening up of new transport routes, data cables, and ports thus become means of statecraft that states attempt to use for their strategic benefit. The functional control over these man-made environments provides concrete means of asymmetric power exertion. In the Arctic context, some scholars have, for instance, been looking at how Russia is manipulating energy flows to further its broader geostrategic interests in Europe. Others have investigated how the United States is using its economic power, most notably in the form of economic sanctions, as a leverage to coerce other states. As an example, Moscow has faced severe challenges as Western actors decide to react to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea by using their geo-economic clout in the form of sanctions directly targeting Russian Arctic projects. Others have focused on how China is using finance, investments, loaned by state-owned banks, and trade relations to cement political alliances and create political leverage. In this context, Russia has turned increasingly towards China, not only to diversify its customer base for its energy products, but also to secure new financial investments and technological know-how to make this project possible in the first place. This has provided China with an opportunity to flex its geo-economic muscles, for example, in the form of much needed financing to Russia's Arctic energy projects. Our third analytical perspective is geoeconomics as discourse, shaping and reproducing worldviews of security strategists and foreign policy makers. This perspective sees discourse as a way of imagining and reimagining a certain geographical space and entrenching it in state practices. To illustrate the approach in more concrete terms, the Arctic has been subject to various discourse productions involving geoeconomics that have either securitized or desecuritized the region. For a long time during the Cold War confrontation, large parts of the Arctic were often constructed as international, disconnected and extremely securitized areas. This started to transform during the latter years of the Cold War. It was the influential speech by Soviet Secretary General Gorbachev in 1987 in Murmansk that called for a joint energy projects between Western and Soviet actors, increased Arctic connectivity via the opening up of the Northern Sea Route for international maritime transport, international cooperation on environmental protection, and more broadly laid down the vision of the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation in various fields. Through this discursive act that involved notable geo-economic and connectivity aspects, many of which are relevant also today, Gorbachev ended up initiating the gradual process of desecuritization of Arctic as an element of a broader Soviet reorientation. Later, during the 2000s, the Arctic re-emerged as a component of contemporary strategic landscape that, as expected growth in openness, connectivity, and geoeconomic prospects were linked to growth in adversarial hard security dynamics. Expert literature and influential media representations started to talk about growing great power competition and fears of the new arms race or even new Cold War in the region. However, expert opinion started to change quickly, characterizing the region as an exceptional area of peace and cooperation, somehow detached from international crisis dynamics. This discursive framing of the region has in many respects defined the Arctic discourse up until today. But I guess my time is up. If you're interested, you can read more about these three research paradigms from this excellent book. Thank you, and I wish you a wonderful seminar.
We thank Harri very much for this virtual intervention and also for timing his recording to be exactly 10 minutes. Maybe as key takeaways, number one, that for a number of reasons, the importance of a geo-economic Arctic is probably exaggerated and old school geopolitical dynamics remain key. And maybe a second takeaway is that if we do then apply a geo-economic vantage point on the Arctic, it's probably useful to keep in mind this interplay between economic statecraft with its focus on competition, economic geography with its focus on the need for cooperation, and then thirdly on discourse or the real life impact on the ground that speech acts can have concerning the Arctic. But in the interest of time, I think we now should move on to our next real-life speaker, and that is Helge, who contributed a chapter to the book on Russia's Arctic agenda and the impact of domestic politics. So, Helge, would you agree with Harri that geopolitical dynamics rule Russia's Arctic agenda, or to what extent would you say has Russia been successful in applying economic statecraft? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll come back to that, but first I just want to say that it's great to be back at FIA, and it's great to be back in front of a live audience and see real people again. So that's very much appreciated, and I hope it will stay this way. And my task in this project has been to cover the domestic Arctic in Russia. And obviously in discussing the potential for improved east-west connectivity across the Arctic, it's vital to bring into the equation the political and the economic processes that shape this vast landmass between northwestern Europe and northeast Asia, that of the Russian Federation. Successful Arctic connectivity to a large extent hinges on Russian ambitions for its own domestic Arctic. And after a period of, I would say, relative neglect of the domestic Arctic, Russia's return to that region from, say, 2008 onwards has been characterized by lofty ideas and grandiose plans for how to develop this region. In my chapter in the book, I take stock of Russia's ambitions for domestic Arctic development, as well as some of the challenges and constraints, like the harsh climate, the dwindling population, the underdeveloped infrastructure, and the lingering budget constraints, in order to assess what ramifications domestic Russian developments may have for the expansion of east-west connectivity. Today, I'll focus on two of the most promising developments, the energy sector and the Northern Sea Road, that have already come up here several times, as well as two of the challenges I've listed, climatic challenges and the dwindling population. But if to start with the energy sector, uncertainty about future demand, combined with the Western sanctions after Crimea that have been targeted against the offshore sector, has meant that the plans for Arctic offshore activity has been hit hard. Hence, so far, the main advances have been made onshore, and primarily on the Yamal Peninsula. The main field on Yamal is the Bobonenkova field, that was developed by Gazprom and has been in operation for almost 10 years now already. It's Russia's third largest gas field, and it supplies natural gas via the pipeline system to the European markets. But more of a game changer maybe is another development on Yamal, that of Novatek's construction of Yamal LNG, Russia's first Arctic plant for production of LNG, which was opened in 2017 and which supplies LNG via the newly developed port, Sabetha, mainly to the Asian market. Oops. Here goes my presentation. Yamal has opened up new possibilities for Russian Arctic gas extraction industry, whereas dependence on pipeline infrastructure locks the production to a specific market. Liquefying the gas turns it into a global commodity, and the LNG production on Yamal is soon to be accompanied by a second LNG plant, Arctic LNG 2 at the Gdynia Peninsula. Thus represents a major breakthrough, I would say, opening new markets in the Asia Pacific. Also, the commercial development of the Northern Sea Road could be construed as a success story. With the forecasts of rapidly melting sea ice and the prospects of a longer sailing season, Moscow is promoting, as we have heard, the Northern Sea Road as an alternative to the Suez Road, arguing that it offers considerably shorter transport distances as well as reduced sailing time. In the current plans for the development of the Russian Arctic zone, the Northern Sea Road has thus become a main priority. This is reflected in the ambitious goals that the Russian authorities have set for the increase in cargo volumes. In his 2018 May decrees, President Putin ordered a sharp rise in the annual volumes. At the time, it was stood at about 20 million tons per year. By the end of Putin's current presidential term, by 2024, it's supposed to reach 80 million. And last year, in connection with the revision of the Arctic strategy, the bar was raised even higher, with the annual target to be 130 million ton by 2035. And I hear some laughter here, but yes, come back to that. First, what is positive seen from a Russian perspective? The NSR can present some impressive growth figures in recent years. Between 2017 and 2019, the volumes almost tripled, reaching 31.5 million tons in 2019. And even last year, with COVID and the crisis, there was a modest growth in the volume. But, as probably all of you know, the NSR has failed to develop into a competitive alternative for transit. And the official target of reaching 80 million by 2024 is obviously not possible to reach given the current trends. Turning to some of the challenges, I'll focus on climate and human resources as mentioned. In recent years, the Arctic has been warming substantially faster than the rest of the world. And whereas the success of the Northern Sea route hinges on this global warming, as soon as we move inland, there is a growing recognition, I would say, that climate change will have detrimental effects that will outweigh the potential gains for the Russian Federation. In the Arctic zone and also beyond, housing and infrastructure have for decades been constructed based on an understanding that permafrost is indeed permanent. This can no longer be taken for granted. Arctic climate is changing rapidly. In 2020, in Verkhoyansk, which is often referred as because of its extreme winter temperature, the summer temperature reached 38 degrees plus Celsius. This is not good for permafrost. Today, some 90% of Russia's gas and diamonds and 30% of its oil are produced in areas covered by permafrost. But this is rapidly changing, and in the official plans for adapting to climate change, the Russian authorities now acknowledge that climate change will have significant and growing impact on the country's socioeconomic development, living conditions, human health, and the economy. An early warning of what may be in store came with a major diesel spill in Norilsk last year. And according to the Ministry for the Development of the Far East and the Arctic, according to the most optimistic current prognosis, with marginal warming, the cost of climate adaptation will be 2 trillion rubles by 2050. But it's more likely that it will be in the range of 9 trillion rubles by this year. And this is only part of the problem, the melting permafrost. Along the Arctic coast, the weather is getting warmer, wetter, and wilder, leading to coastal erosion. The Arctic coast is eroding 3 to 4 times faster than in more temperate parts of the world. Arctic islands and coastlines are disappearing into the sea. And moving inland, global warming has been linked to more frequent wildfires and to flooding. A second critical factor that I will mention here today is the human resources. They are in short supply. If the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation were an independent country, it would be the world's 7th biggest country. It's smaller than Australia, but it's bigger than India. But the population of this enormous territory is only 2.4 million. And more importantly, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, the population of the Arctic zone has declined dramatically. Particularly in the 1990s, but also during the last 15 years, an estimated 300,000 people have left the Arctic zone, or the population numbers have dropped by 300,000. In its very optimistic 2020 Arctic strategy, Moscow has stated its ambition to turn the tide. The goal is to achieve a stabilization by 2030 and a positive net in migration to the Arctic zone by 2035. And one measure to achieve this has been to introduce the so-called Arctic hectare, where people can apply for 1 hectare of land for free. And this is meant to draw people into the region. The same scheme has been used to get people to move to the Far East. There it's been operating for already close to 5 years, and only 80,000 people have signed up. And we should also add that most of these are probably locals. So far, about 3,000 have signed up for an Arctic hectare, the vast majority in Murmansk Oblast. But so far it's only open to locals, so we don't know whether it will be able to attract people, but most likely not. So a more promising development is probably that the Russian authorities now also are trying harder to keep the current population or encourage the current population to stay in the Arctic. Currently the Arctic zone scores far below the national average when it comes to everything from life expectancy to housing conditions. And the main goal of the new Arctic strategy is to improve quality of life for residents in the far north, in the Arctic zone. The strategy features a smorgasbord of promises of construction of modern and affordable housing, better education, better health facilities, etc., etc. But given the history of underfunding of the Arctic strategy programs and the failed promises that have been made in the past, it's doubtful, I think, whether there will be sufficient resources to enable Moscow to live up to these promises. And then, to conclude, because I don't know how I'm doing with time, but still have
1 minute.
1 minute, yes. Then, the Russian authorities are again talking about mastering the Arctic with great confidence, about освоение of the Arctic. But these great ambitions are, I would argue, met with even greater challenges as regards opening up this treasure trove of frozen natural riches. Many plans seem to peter out in the encounter with the harsh Arctic realities. The rapid warming of the Arctic opens up new prospects for east-west connectivity, as we've heard, and less ice and a longer sailing season could make the NSR more competitive as a commercial alternative to the Suez route in the future. As of yet, however, the volumes of international transit remain very low. And the recent introduction of protectionist legislation making it compulsory for vessels transporting oil and gas to sail under Russian flag, as well as requiring that all new tankers engaging in this business to be built at Russian yards. These are factors that are likely to dampen the interest of international companies as regards developing destination shipping in the Arctic. Moscow's approach to the development of the Russian Arctic is clearly informed, I would argue, but by what we in the volume refer to as geoeconomics, as economic statecraft. This is not a matter of win-win, as seen from Moscow, but of sovereignty, of power politics and control. Russia wants to maintain control over routes, over resources and infrastructure. Moreover, security issues loom in the background. Ice has traditionally covered Russia's back, but climate change is now exposing this flank, and when commercial interests connected with the further development of the Northern Sea Route or the potential future exploitation of offshore hydrocarbon resources clash with military security interests, the former are likely to draw the short straw. So in sum, the ice keeps melting, but the transformation of the Russian Arctic from a frozen backyard to a global transport artery still remains a distant prospect.
Thanks, Helge. I think as our only speaker from abroad, you were entitled to a couple of extra minutes. Thank you then for outlining Russia's ambitions of so-called mastering the Arctic, as you also mentioned it in the chapter, including perhaps through the success story of the development of hydrocarbon resources, but also then for spelling out all these numerous challenges that Russia is facing today, including climate change and its fallout, and the melting of permafrost and its effect on gas and oil lines, for example. Let's move on to the next speaker. So, Frank. So the book is about increasing competition, great power competition in the Arctic, and about how the region is gradually shifting from a zone of peace and cooperation to a more contentious environment. But I would have one possible double question for you, because the book is also about the impact of that more contentious environment on this region, on the Nordic Baltic countries. So the question would be, when thinking about Chinese strategic ambitions in the Arctic, what are China's interests in the Nordic Baltic region? And then secondly, how has the region itself reacted to an increased Chinese presence? So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Bart, for the excellent questions. My chapter in itself focused on Chinese security interest in the Arctic, as they are quite often overlooked. One reason for it can be also that in 2019, when China published its Arctic Policy White Paper, it was published by State Council Information Office, which actually is also the nameplate of Central Propaganda Department. It, of course, failed to mention its security interest, but they are nevertheless present there at least since 1959, when China started its submarine development program, which measurably failed, but the general responsible for it, its personal secretary at the time, was nobody else than Xi Jinping himself. So the current administration and Xi Jinping himself is very aware of the strategic importance of Arctic. Chinese strategic thinking is inspired by the 19th century US naval officer Alfred Mahan, who believed that the state's international standing depends on the might of its navy, and China, to be contender for the top spot, must be able to pose challenge to US not only regionally in South and East China Seas, but also in the Arctic Ocean. And the military white paper published in 2019 stressed the importance of developing China into a blue water navy with support ports to protect its interests. China already has stakes in 12 European ports and has been very much interested in developing also strategic infrastructure in the Nordic Baltic region. Few examples: Tallinn, Klaipeda, Kirkenes and Lysekil ports coming to mind. In addition, China has been interested in developing old navy port and airports in Greenland and in Finland, Tallinn-Helsinki Tunnel and Arctic Railway connecting Finnish polar regions with railway network. So far, China has not been able to gain a foothold in the region due to security, feasibility, and environmental concerns. Based on geoeconomic considerations, Estonian Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service pointed out that strategic infrastructure projects and investments pose a security risk due to economic dependence that a foreign power might exploit for political reasons. Estonia and Lithuania have faced sanctions, and Lithuania is currently under some sanctions from China. But the first sanctions the Baltics faced were in 2011 and 2013, when Estonia and Lithuania separately received Dalai Lama. The sanctions impact then and now is minuscule, as exports to China in both cases make less than 2% of total exports. So it is not worth to overemphasize them. But it's also a sign of empty promises, as both Estonia and Lithuania have been part of the 16+1 format for almost a decade. China has been more successful in making inroads in the region in regard of scientific cooperation. China operates or has access to 5 Arctic space ground stations in Finland, Iceland, 2 in Svalbard, and 1 in Kiruna, Sweden, and plans to develop 1 in Greenland. Space ground stations are dual-use facilities because they enable command and control of satellites and facilitate data transfer related to the missions, and also enable intelligence gathering. Data collection at foreign ground stations is likely to be a subject of the national cybersecurity law, according to which personal or important information must be stored in China. And in the light of recent developments, Sweden has reevaluated its contract with the Chinese counterparts and has declined to extend the cooperation in its operated ground stations in Sweden, Chile, and Australia. In regard of scientific cooperation, I truly recommend everybody to read a forthcoming paper from Swedish Center for China Studies that analyzed 1,300 scientific jointly produced papers between Sweden and China that had serious security implications, as many of the universities were directly related to the Chinese military. One of the articles downloaded from Scopus even had in its title the name Military Radar. So this, of course, is something of importance to dig deeper into the future. Now more about Russia. In Russia's Arctic, Chinese scholars have highlighted the importance of 5 ports in Russia's Arctic, which the Chinese scholars see with the highest potential based on development, based on the potential for development. And these criteria are location, climate, population, has already been mentioned here by Helge, existing infrastructure, and previous projects. In mayhem spirit, Chinese see these ports as fulcrum points for promoting development, and with it Chinese influence deeper into the hinterland, as 2 of the highlighted ports are on the Lena and Ob estuaries. This is of course a concern for Kremlin, as Chinese exchanges in the Arctic often bypass the central government. One example of it is China-Russia Arctic Forum, held since 2012, with target audience from scientists, local level leaders, private sector, and international organizations. Forum aims to generate necessary soft power for the acceptance of China as a near-Arctic state and Arctic stakeholder that is believed to support economic engagement and capacity building. For capacity building, Chinese universities and institutes related to the military and defense industry, some even called the 7 Sons of National Defense, have established Arctic research centers with Russian counterparts in my research, I was able to track down 4 these kind of research centers. Particularly interesting to the Nordic Baltic region is Sino-Russian cooperation in underwater acoustic sensing that can be used for target detection and anti-submarine warfare. Finnish state-led project Arctic Connect promises to connect internet users from Europe, Russia and Asia via the underwater fiber optic cable along the Northern Sea route. With the use of distributed acoustic sensing technology, first developed by the British company called Kinetic in 2006, with the main purpose of anti-submarine warfare. And this technology in itself also widely used now for civilian purposes. These cables could, along the Northern Sea route, could be used for underwater target detection. As the platform provider is Chinese company Huawei Marine, Chinese intelligence gathering and cybersecurity capabilities would improve. According to the Chinese intelligence law, Chinese legal and natural entities are compelled by law to grant access to its resources to the Chinese intelligence services. Data protection would improve for both China and Russia because big amounts of data traveling between Europe and Asia will travel along the cables that both have stakes in, and not via the cables that US has access to. Snowden revelations revealed that cables and the supporting infrastructure are important for intelligence gathering. In addition, China and Russia jointly built capacities in underwater acoustic sensing could be used for the benefit of both sides' nuclear deterrence in a strategically important Arctic region against their shared adversary, the US. This should be of concern to the US and its allies, as NATO's northern flank's defense starts in the Arctic. And just a final quick example, if time permits. In July 2019, China-Russia Polar Acoustic Symposium was co-organized by Harbin Engineering University, one of the 7 sons of national defense, and Russian Far Eastern Federal University. It was held to exchange knowledge on under-ice acoustic research and technology. The 2 Chinese co-organizers of this event were National Key Laboratory of Underwater Acoustic Sensing and Technology and Key Laboratory of Marine Information Acquisition and Security Industry and Information Technology. I'm really sorry, but these names are so long. To shorten them, I will say the former has conducted research on underwater acoustic technology for naval weapons development. And it highlights one of its target research topic being target detection and localization. Currently, it is undertaking 202 projects with total value of almost 30 million euros. And the latter is China's most advanced platform for research and development in marine information technology, highlighting research in underwater sensors and data protection. They see themselves part of China's plan of developing China into a maritime power and blue water navy. And since its establishment in 2017, it has undertaken 130 projects from the Navy, local provinces and ministries with a total value of almost 20 million euros. Contrary to my colleague Aimar Ventsel, who's focused on trust, and this topic is also widely analyzed in my report, I would maybe recommend not only look to the China-Russia relationship from the viewpoint of trust or mistrust. As we know, even amongst allies, trust is difficult to find, and even allies spy after each other, as we have unfortunately also found out. So I would focus more on actual cooperation fields that have direct impact on our security, and have also joint interest for them to co-develop, as it will enhance their stance in a geopolitically important region, but unfortunately hinders our security and our capabilities there. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I think your contribution today and also to the volume is highly valuable because it exactly assesses China-Russia cooperation, something which is very much feared here in the West, and also because your chapter chimes with many other chapters in the volume in outlining that the mistrust of China is increasing, that there is a growing awareness of security risks as well, and that countries in the Nordic Baltic region are growing increasingly cautious of that. Let's now move on to Julia. So there has been a lot of talk on connectivity as economic warfare or as the arms race of the 21st century even. And indeed, climate change opens up opportunities for more connectivity, but at the same time, this leads to more competition and security threats and may in the long run even lead to conflict. But connectivity is a sword with two edges, not just tensions and competition, but there's also a need to cooperate. So what about cooperation, and can there be specifically cooperation with countries like China, for example, in the field of climate change? Please.
Thank you, Bart. Indeed, I was going to talk about China's climate policy and its relevance to the Arctic region. And in fact, I think I don't have to explain how it is relevant. We all know that the Arctic region is warming much faster than the global average. We also know that China's emissions are the highest in the world. China now accounts for 27% of global emissions of GHGs. China also contributes to global and regional climate change in the Arctic through its air pollution and emissions of black carbon. Again, the topic which is, should be quite familiar to the Finnish audience, since Finland has been promoting action on black carbon emissions through the Arctic Council. So all of that shows that China's climate policy is very important to consider, both for in the global context, but also for the future of the Arctic region. And overall, China's approach to climate change over time has changed significantly, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, climate goals are now incorporated into all important energy and economic development strategies. And this is not so much due to considering climate change as an important threat, but more due to various domestic factors. There are three factors. The first one has to do with energy security. China is very dependent on fuel imports, especially oil, and of course this is a massive vulnerability for the Chinese government. The second factor is air pollution. We all know that in Chinese megacities air pollution can be severe, and the Chinese government again prioritizes various measures to address this air pollution. And the third factor has to do with the limits of the current economic growth model in China, which is very resource intensive and inefficient. So against these three factors, low carbon development is considered to be a win-win strategy by the Chinese government. And various measures, various policies have been adopted to achieve climate goals. And if you look at the climate-related goals in the last 13th five-year plan, which ended in 2020, almost all climate-related goals were overachieved. Of course, climate policy in China is intertwined with, at the core of it is reducing reliance on coal, and coal accounts currently for 59% of the country's energy mix. China is continuing to build new coal plants, but a very important detail is that these coal plants, they don't run at full capacity, and the average utilization rates currently stand at 50%. China's policy steps to reduce emissions of CO2 have already led to very impressive cuts. And in fact, before 2016, there was even a conversation internationally that China's emissions peaked already. This didn't happen, and they started increasing again, and they continued increasing even during the pandemic. However, there is now there are signs of this increase slowing down. And this shows that reducing coal reliance in China is a very difficult challenge for the country. And of course, climate goals domestically have to be balanced against various other policy goals, short-term economic recovery especially. And they also, climate policies, they also have to accommodate various vested interests in the coal industry and in the regional governments. This nexus between the central government and the regions is very complicated in China. If you now follow the news, China is experiencing very severe energy crisis, and in some regions, power cuts, they have even affected the public sector, so there is no electricity in hospitals and schools, and some plants have to run at a partial capacity. This energy crisis is quite unprecedented for China. There are many reasons behind it. Experts attribute the crisis mainly to rising coal prices, and behind this, one of the reasons of that is that the government is trying to boost the economy by launching several large construction projects. But in some regions, apparently, it's also a result of climate goals that the regional governments are trying to reach their yearly climate goals. Yes, in the regions. So this basically shows that this low carbon transformation is going to be not a stable, gradual process in China, but a very volatile process. If we talk about China's role in international climate policy, it also has changed from a laggard to a leader. We all know that China was instrumental in the success of the Paris Agreement, and it has been strengthening its leadership role. A year ago at the UN General Assembly, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced that China would aims for carbon neutrality by 2060 and for emissions to peak before 2030. Of course, there aren't so many details behind this goal, but so far what has emerged, and this something that has changed since I wrote the chapter, China announced that this carbon neutrality goal covers all GHGs, so not only CO2, which is very significant for achieving global climate goals. So the long-term climate goals, neutrality goals, are clear. What is not clear is how China is going to get there. And if you look, for example, at various near-term steps, the 14th five-year plan is quite unambitious on climate targets. Then China also has not submitted its updated NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution under the Paris Agreement, which it's supposed to submit. The targets that it had communicated before for this NDC are also not very ambitious. Of course, when we talk about China and global climate change, we also have to mention its outward investments, especially in coal industry in various developing countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, in Africa, which are enormous. Again, what has changed since I wrote the chapter on China? Just 2 weeks ago, again at the UN General Assembly, China announced that it would, the exact wording was something like it would stop it would stop building new coal plants abroad. Again, as it happens with China's announcements, they are quite laconic. they lack in detail. So it's not clear whether this covers financing or also construction. So we don't have much information yet, but it's again a very significant announcement strengthening China's position in global climate policy. And it came before the COP26 in Glasgow, which is also significant. So if you look at the role of China in international climate policy, recently what many experts observe is that China is pursuing a much more independent and unilateral path. So if you look at these various announcements, China doesn't really coordinate them with other major players in global climate policy. And it's definitely a leader. It has something to show before the upcoming COP in Glasgow. And so to sum up, China has been continually strengthening its domestic climate policy. Its long-term climate goals are very ambitious. It's not clear, as I mentioned, how China is going to get there. Its near-term steps are not always unclear, and they can be contradictory. However, for the Arctic region, China's overall policy is aligned with policies of other major actors, and this, in my opinion, provides a space for cooperation. And there are two areas, immediate areas for this cooperation. One is increasing scientific activities. Scientific cooperation has already been central to China's involvement in Arctic affairs. Science cooperation can also play a key role in integrating and socializing China in the Arctic. Such cooperation can, for instance, include a comprehensive assessment of the Arctic footprint of China. This exercise has already been done for the EU. And then another important area where China can contribute under the Arctic Council, there are various work streams, and one of them has to do with the reducing emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon and methane. China hasn't been very active there yet, but the framework for action under the Arctic Council provides observer states opportunities for participating in the implementation of this framework, and China should be encouraged to participate actively. So to conclude, the Arctic is often discussed through the lenses of great power rivalry and the race for natural resources. Of course, it's good to remember that all of that is unfolding in the context and due to global climate change. So any advancement of Arctic diplomacy should provide a space for multilateral cooperation on climate change, and especially with China as a very important actor. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia, for these key points on China's climate change policy and also the ramification that has for the connectivity policy of the country, and also for giving us quite a, let's say, optimistic and positive view on the possibilities for cooperation, in particular in the field of science. Okay, it's time to wrap up. It's clear that today we've only been able to scratch the surface of the key themes of the book, so I do urge you all to have a look at some of the other chapters dealing with different issues. We had the FIA forum last week, and also there the Arctic popped up as a key topic, so I'm sure that the region and the security challenges will be part of the discussion also here at FIA in future seminars. So I look forward to welcoming you there again in the near future. So a big thank you to all of our speakers, including one virtual one, and thank you all to the audience for coming out to a real live event in person. This was amazing. Thanks a lot.